the system was modified and land assigned following the systems of native administration, where specific territories were assigned to each ethnic group. In this context, conflict between pastoralists and sedentary farmers became an important cause of the Darfur violence. There was indeed frequent friction between the settled tribes and the nomadic tribes, mainly due to the lack of resources such as land, livestock, water, and other ecological resources. Environmental degradation and competition over resources are undoubtedly some of the principal causes of the conflict in Darfur. However, the conflict was also the result of a long history of ethnic marginalization by Sudan's ruling elites. In Darfur, Arab tribes considered they were not sufficiently represented in the Darfur-dominated local administration. And in 1986, a number of Arab tribes formed what became known as the Arab Alliance, aimed at establishing their political dominance and control of the region. Meanwhile, Darfur leaders mistrusted the increasing tendency of the government to favor the Arabs. This fear of Arab domination was exacerbated by the Sadiq el-Mahdi government, which between 1986 and 1989 adopted a policy of arming Arab Baggara militia from Darfur and Kordofan, known as Murahelin. Similar to the militias involved in the Darfur conflict in 2003, the Murahelin formed a militia based in Darfur, employed by el-Mahdi governments and its military successor for almost 20 years as counterinsurgency force against the southern-based rebels, the Sudan's People's Liberation Movement Army, SPLA. The Murahelin primarily focused on raiding, looting, displacing, enslaving, and punishing the Dinka and Nuer civilians living in SPLA territories, from which communities the latter forces were in part drawn. In 1988-1989, the intermittent clashes in Darfur evolved into full-scale conflict between the Darfur and Arab communities. Rather than working to defuse tensions and implement peace agreements, the Khartoum government inflamed those by arming the Arab tribes and neglecting the core issues underlying the conflict over resources, the need for rule of law and socio-economic development in the region. The conflict with raged Darfur from 2003 has therefore deep roots. Your Honors, the victim's account of the events corroborates the prosecution case. In 2003, the tension increased in Darfur and triggered multiple episodes of violence. As a result, a conflict of a non-international character started between the government of Sudan and Janjaweed militia on one side and rebel armed groups on the other side. As a reaction to the SLA attacks of August 2003 in the Mukyar area, following a policy initiated in other parts of Darfur, the government of Sudan recruited and mobilized militia forces in West Darfur. This force was conceived as a key addition to the small number of army troops deployed in the region and to the use of aerial bombardments. These militias included mainly nomadic or semi-nomadic groups of Arab origin. The government-backed militias became known by the victims as Janjaweed. The Sudanese government and the Janjaweed militia had a clear hierarchy. They were well structured and organized, armed, and able to plan and successfully carry out hundreds of attacks against the civilian population. They not only had effective tactics in implementing attacks, but had significant military power. Mr. Abdallah Rahman, known to the victims as Ali Koushib, was aware of the existence of the armed conflict and engaged in military operations. In the course of the attack, several crimes were committed, including murder, torture, cruel treatment, pillaging, and rape. All these elements correspond to the contextual elements and underlying acts of war crimes as established by the practice of this court, described in the document containing the charges and in the prosecution pre-confirmation brief. The account of events provided by the victims reveals that government forces and militia targeted unarmed women, men, and children. Victims suffer from a series of acts of violence, or, put in other words, a campaign or operation carried out against the localities where they lived. The campaign involved the multiple commission of acts referred to in Article 7.1 of the statute against a part of the civilian population because of its perceived assimilation and support to the rebel groups. Clearly, Your Honors, the victims of the attacks were not taking active part in the conflict which was raging in Darfur at the time relevant to the charges. They were instead part of the civilian population. In accordance with the chapeau of Article 7.1 of the statute, the attack against a civilian population has to be widespread or systematic in the sense of the attack being massive, frequent, carried out collectively with considerable seriousness, directed against a multiplicity of victims, or involving patterns of crimes in the sense of non-accidental repetition of similar criminal conduct on a regular basis. And indeed, in the present case, the attack was both widespread and systematic. The victims' accounts of events reveal that the crimes they suffered from were neither spontaneous nor isolated acts of violence. They were instead part of a planned, directed, and organized attack against them because of their ethnicity and because perceived as supporters of rebels. A victim describes the attack in the village of Kodom as follows, and I quote, "I was awakened by the sound of heavy artillery and approaching Janjaweed. The Janjaweed were in front, and then there were 2 cars from the police behind them carrying the ammunition." End of quote. While many fled the village and survived, a lot of elderly or sick people who could not flee were killed. I quote again, "Everyone ran away to save their lives. Most of the old men were killed that day. Everyone who didn't run was killed. End of quote. Victims describe the attacks to the villages in a consistent way. The first sign was a threatening drone of a plane, old Russian Antonovs flying over remote Sudanese villages, dispatching their load of bombs. They exploded among the straw-roofed huts, sending terrified families rushing for safety, but there was none. Next came the Janjaweed, mounted on camels and horses' backs, with communications equipment such as Turaya satellite phones, and armed with AK-47 rifles and whips. The Janjaweed murdered any man and boy of fighting age, gang-raped the women, often in front of their families, and burned their houses. The villagers' cattle were stolen, all their possessions carted off. Other victims say they were attacked by helicopter gunships. The survivors of aerial bombardment were attacked in follow-up offensives led by Janjaweed, regular government soldiers, or both. Janjaweed are invariably said to use horses and camels, while government soldiers are described as traveling in military vehicles. Both dressed in combat fatigues and both well armed. Some victims talk of being stripped and repeatedly whipped or beaten with the butt of a gun. The Janjaweed round up herds of cattle, camels, and goats, and steal all their other possessions. The theft of livestock was aimed at rendering the villages destitute for life. Your Honors, livestock is the main form of wealth in Darfur. Throughout much of the region, pastoral population count their wealth in the head of livestock they possess. The impact of the theft of livestock on the lives and livelihoods of millions of people in the region was colossal. Villages that were destroyed and emptied of their population were selected on the basis of ethnicity. Burnt Fur, and to some extent Zagawa and Masalit villages, were sometimes in close proximity to villages belonging to other ethnicities that have not been touched and in which the population continued to live. The intact villages sometimes belonged to Arab and other non-Zagawa, non-Masalit, or non-Fur ethnic groups. The attack launched against the civilian population was conducted pursuant to or in furtherance of an organizational policy. The evidence presented by the prosecution suggests that since the beginning of the rebel insurgency in February 2003, and in particular since the escalation of the conflict in mid-2003, the government of Sudan pursued a military strategy deliberately targeting the civilian population through a combination of indiscriminate and deliberate aerial bombardments, a scorched earth campaign, and denial of access to humanitarian assistance. The evidence points to a systematic campaign by government forces and allied militias to violently force rural civilians from their homes and render them destitute and corralled in government towns and camps. Villages were not attacked randomly, but were emptied across wide areas in operations that reportedly lasted for several days or were repeated several times until the population was finally driven away. The evidence also points at mass executions of men belonging predominantly to the Fur tribe in Wadi Saleh. The men were killed on the same day in different places in Mukhyar and Delej. In particular, at the beginning of March 2004, Sudanese forces, including local officials, police, and Janjaweed militias, rounded up and killed more than 200 displaced Fur men, including community leaders, in a coordinated sweep of the Garsila, Delej, and Mukhyar areas. People displaced from villages east of Garsila and Delej were specifically targeted. A victim of the events in Delej recalled, I quote, "The soldiers and the Janjaweed went to Sindhu to fight the rebellion. When they came back, they surrounded Delej and catch a lot of people, maybe 100, 120, and collected them in the police station over 3 days. Then they took them away in groups and they never came back. People saw them being taken away in groups of 40, 25. They were killed in different places. The killed men were buried in mass graves. We could not properly bury and mourn our loved ones." End of quote. The operation was clearly planned and coordinated over a wide geographic area. Amongst the men taken were sheikhs and umda. A victim who survived one of the mass executions explains, I quote, "We were taken in trucks and cars to a valley a few miles from Delej. Then they lined us up, made us kneel down and bend our heads, and shot us from behind. I was left for dead. When the Janjaweed left, I waited for some time, maybe half an hour, and then I ran as fast as I could back to Delej. When I arrived at home, my wife was scared and terrified in seeing me. My clothes were covered in blood, and I was in really bad state." End of quote. Victims who survived, managed to escape, or were released all recall the atrocities they suffered from, obliged to lay down on their stomach for hours in the overcrowded police station, or tied to trees or in the ground in the open area outside the police station, with no water or food, some for days, repeatedly humiliated, mistreated, tortured. In Mukhyar, events followed a similar pattern. These elements correspond to the interpretation by different pretrial chambers of this court of the policy requirement and of the notion of organization, which cannot be understood in a restrictive way. All these factors correspond to the contextual element of crimes against humanity, as identified in the practice of the court, described in the document containing the charges, and in the prosecution pre-confirmation brief. In May 2004, the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights issued the report on the situation of human rights in the Darfur region of Sudan. It stated that the situation in Darfur was characterized by the following features, I quote, A. Repeated attacks on civilians by the military forces of the government of Sudan and its proxy militia. B. The use of indiscriminate aerial bombardments and ground attacks on unarmed civilians. C. The use of disproportionate force by government and Janjaweed. D. Janjaweed operated with total impunity and in close coordination with the forces of the government of Sudan. E. The attacks appear to have been largely ethnically based, with the groups targeted being essentially Fur, Zagawa, Masalit tribes, which are reportedly of African origin. F. The pattern of attacks on civilians include killing, rape, pillage, including of livestock, destruction of property, including water sources. And G. There has been massive, often forced displacement of much of the population of Darfur. End of quote. Your Honors, I will not address in detail the charges against the suspect. The prosecution has provided ample illustration of the type of crimes committed. For the purpose of my presentation today, I will limit my observation to two specific matters of specific importance for the interest of the victims we represent. First, the crime of persecution. Second, the crime of forced displacement. The commission of a crime of persecution under Article 7(1)h of the statute requires the infliction of serious bodily or mental harm amounting to intentional and severe deprivation of fundamental rights, contrary to international law, by reason of identity of a group or collectivity, committed against any identifiable group or collectivity on political, racial, national, ethnic, cultural, religious, gender, or other grounds universally recognized as impermissible under international law. Victims recall the particular cruelty of the Janjaweed Acts. According to them, murders of civilians were widespread. So were the rapes. Victims also put emphasis on the crimes of pillaging, looting, destruction of properties and land. They explained that the militia took everything they owned: pants, caps, clothes, livestock, representing the key source of income of affected people. All these acts were clearly intended to cause suffering and injury to the members of the targeted group. Victims indicate that they were targeted because belonging to the ethnicity of a rebels group and therefore assimilated to them. Victims also explained that it was notorious that the government wanted to target them. I quote, "They targeted us because we are Fur," end of quote. Quote again, "We knew that they would have attacked us because they thought that we were on the side of the rebels," end of quote. These are sentences frequently used by victims to explain why they were targeted. Therefore, the recognition of a crime of persecution in connection with the attacks and the events in Delech and Mukyar is an important element that they hope will be retained by your honors. Another important aspect of the victimization in this case is the forcible displacement and its extent. The accounts of the victims corroborate the evidence presented by the prosecution on the displacement of mainly Fur civilians from their places of residence. Victims recall that they were forced to flee to escape their systematic extermination, abandoning their goods, sometimes their relatives trying to survive. the exodus was particularly challenging since victims were left with no means of transportation and had to proceed mainly by foot. Some of them managed to be transported in truck, transporting millet. The journey from hell to a relatively safe place was long, with little or no food available. As a result, a number of victims died along the road, mostly elderly and babies or young children. All elements of the crimes of forced displacement are present in this case. 1. Victims did not have a free or genuine choice to remain in the territory where they were present. In the words of the ICTY Appeal Chamber, the displacement is a crime when it's forced, carried out by expulsion or other forms of coercion, such that the displacement is involuntary in nature and the relevant persons had no genuine choice in their displacement. It is indeed the absence of genuine choice that makes the displacement unlawful. And the jurisprudence of the ad hoc tribunals interpreted the word forcible to include threat, the use of force, fear of violence, and illegal detention. Second, the forceful character of a displacement is determined not only by physical force, but also by coercion, such as that caused by fear of violence, duress, detention, psychological oppression, abuse of power, or taking advantage of a coercive environment. In the words of investigating judges in the second case at the extraordinary chambers in the Court of Cambodia, the population movement occurred by force since the population was coerced to move by threat, physical violence, or by orders which they felt would add to serious danger if disobeyed. 3. Several acts amounting to coercion were committed. In this regard, in the Kenyan cases, pre-trial chamber 2 considered that acts of burning, destruction of property, and killing resulted in coercing victims to flee the area. The destruction of homes, the brutality of the killing and injuries, the rape of perceived ODM supporters, and the public announcements to the effect that all Luos must leave amounted to coercion, which caused the attacked residents to leave their homes and seek shelters in IDP camp. This leads me, Your Honor, to the issue of the criminal liability of Mr. Abdallah Rahman. The evidence adduced by the prosecution suggests that the suspect played a key role during the period covered by the charges. In particular, the evidence shows that he was directly involved in the establishment of the objectives and strategies of a campaign of attacks against part of the civilian population, including ordering the attack and brutalized civilians. According to the victims, one of the leaders of the Janjaweed militia forces in the area was a man named Ali Kousheb, who was based in Garcila. He was known in the area because he was the owner of a shop, pharmacy, for animal products in Garcila, where a lot of farmers bought material. This explains why and how victims are able to identify Mr. Abdarrahman, known to them as Ali Kousheb, as the leader of the militia. Mr. Abdallah Rahman made an essential contribution to the commission of a crime charged, being present at the location of the crimes, ordering the crimes, participating directly in the commission of the crimes. yet knowledge and intent in the meaning of Article 30 of the statute. Mr. President, Your Honors, the charges brought by the prosecution today against Mr. Abdallah Rahman represent an infinitesimal part of the crimes committed in West Darfur during the relevant period. Victims indicate that between at least August 2003 and March 2004, Janjaweed and government forces attacked several villages, predominantly Fur, in the areas surrounding Delej, Garcia, Mukhar, and Skataya, including Arawala, Forgo, Taringa, Andi, Fere, Cascadi, Seder, Gauzir, Unjaimena, Tendi, and Tiro. In their accounts, victims recall that between 14 and 17 August 2003, at least 7 villages in the area were attacked by government and militia forces. By November 2003, towns like Bindisi and Mukhar more than tripled in size due to the arrival of displaced people from the surrounding villages. In accordance with Human Rights Watch reports, more than 80 villages in the areas were attacked, looted, and burned, sometimes more than once. After the collapse of the ceasefire talks between the government of Sudan and the rebel groups in December 2003, the then Sudanese President Omar el-Bashir promised, as reported by Agence France-Presse on 31st December 2003, I quote, to annihilate the hirelings, traitors, agents, and renegades, end of quote. Following these words, the Sudanese government, together with allied militia, conducted a massive offensive throughout Darfur in January and February 2004, impeding access to humanitarian agency. We tried to assist hundreds of thousands of homeless, internally displaced persons. Mr. President, Your Honors, it is a story of unrest, disorder, lost chances and opportunities, which had, still have, and will have an impact on generations. What has been the impact of the crimes on the victims? There are no precise figures and estimates vary, but according to the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights on Impunity and Accountability in Darfur for 2014, by that time, over 300,000 people have been killed in Darfur since the conflict started in February 2003. In October 2020, the United Nations Mine Action Service concluded that the conflict in Darfur resulted in the death of up to 300,000 people and the displacement of over 2.6 million people, majority of whom are still in internally displaced persons camps. The conflict has profound and devastating consequences for the victims. All of them endure psychological trauma and physical suffering. The murder of their loved ones is indelibly marked in their memory and often associated with development of post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms. Abuses against women and girls have been widespread and systematic. The Janjaweed targeted women and girls in their villages while fleeing and in IDP camps, in total impunity and the acquiescence of the government's forces. Victims report gang rapes, sexual slavery, rapes of pregnant women, while women who have resisted rape have been beaten, tortured, sometimes killed, or had their legs broken to prevent their escape. Used as a tactic of war by the Janjaweed, the main goal of rapes was community destabilization. Rape was used as a means not only to abuse and degrade the woman, but also to humiliate the male members of her family and community by exposing their inability to protect the women. This practice has been marked by relentless cruelty. Many amongst the women who were pregnant at the time are reported to have been killed, as symbolizing the enemy and its reproductive capacity. Because of the war and the gender dimension of the violence during the conflict, in which men were essentially killed and women raped, many men have died or disappeared. As a consequence, a large number of women were left alone to care for their children, with no possible access to adequate treatment or counseling. Fear of retaliation, shame, and stigmatization also prevented them from accessing appropriate health care. All the victims were also materially affected, having lost their means of subsistence and resources. They are lacking an income today, and some of them live in extreme poverty. Because of the attacks, life in the villages became impossible. The widespread destruction of property undermined the chances of most victims to return to their places when peace is eventually achieved and security conditions allowed. The raids displaced millions of civilians and led to long walks to displacement camps, during which victims were exposed to further attacks, in addition to the terrible condition of the displacement, suffering from hunger, thirst, lack of medical care. Many victims still live today in exile, either in camps for internally displaced people or in refugee camps outside Sudan. In many of the countries where victims fled, such as Egypt or Israel, they live at the margin of the society in dire economic and health conditions. A significant number of them report that after more than 15 years, they are still waiting for the determination of their status of refugee, a condition which will allow them to receive some assistance. Such precariousness prevents them from finding a decent job, let aside the possibility to receive medical treatment and/or an education. The displacement has indeed long-lasting consequences on the life of the victims. When narrating their personal stories and sufferings, they always provide details about their living conditions and challenges faced today in the IDP camps or as refugees or asylum seekers. Remarkably, however, Your Honor, they still have hope. When asked about their future, most of the victims say they want to go back to Darfur when Darfur is safe and when they can get back their lands. Mr. President, Your Honors, the start of these proceedings has finally given victims hope. When contacted for the purpose of explaining them their right to participate and helping them to complete application forms, they unanimously expressed their gratitude for being able to finally convey their story and sufferings to someone. They want the judges to know what happened to them, but they also insist on indicating that their quest for justice will be satisfied only when the full extent of the crimes committed and of their victimization will be recognized. For victims, these proceedings represent a starting point. They hope that the trial will follow and that further investigations will be conducted. Victims expect an independent, impartial, transparent and efficient justice, capable of establishing the truth with regard to the crimes they suffer from. Participation in the proceedings is first and foremost an individual step, which enables each victim to share his or her story and knowledge of events. Victims' participation is also a matter of fighting impunity, making accountable the ones responsible for the crimes so that justice is done and moving towards reconciliation become possible. We can assure you, Your Honours, that the mere fact of being represented and the ability to voice their concerns is part of what could be referred to or considered as reparation in the broad meaning of the term. This concludes, Your Honour, the presentation of the victims participating in these proceedings. We thank you on behalf of the victims that we represent and of the applicants that hopefully will participate in the future in the proceedings for listening today to their views and concerns.
Thank you very much. I thank the three legal representatives of victims for the submissions on the merits. This now takes us to the submissions of the defense. It's 12:20. Very good. Mr. Pauci, the floor is yours.
Je vous remercie.
Mr. Lauci, thank you, Mr. President. Should I count on having 40 minutes ahead of me for this session?
Yes, I will let you know when the time is gone. Just please proceed.
Mr. Lauci, very well. Mr. President, Your Honours, I would also like to greet Madam Prosecutor, who is present this morning, doing me the honour of being present this morning. And I am addressing the court before you today with great humility. Great humility in taking the floor after the presentations that we have had, full of eloquence and compassion on the part of the three legal representatives for victims. Now, what the defence intends to expose over the 4 hours to come will not be agreeable for the victims. It might be a source of deception and frustration. And as an introduction, I would like to ask for their apology. And as the defense intends to demonstrate, Mr. Mohammed Ali Abd al-Rahman is not the right individual, is not the correct suspect, is not Ali Koushib, and to send him to trial to be potentially convicted would be nothing more than another further injustice, which would be additional to those injustices outlined by the legal representatives for victims. We are at a critical stage or juncture of the legal process. The Office of the Prosecutor, who represents no less than international public order, has presented its charges, has presented its evidence, and has requested that Mr. Mr. Ali Mohammed Ali Abd al-Rahman be sent to trial. The legal representatives for victims have, on their part, or for their part, presented the views and concerns of the victims and have imparted the suffering that these victims and witnesses have endured as set out in the charges presented by the Office of the Prosecutor. And at this critical juncture, there is only one way forward. One way forward that should and will be heard, that of the defence, which alone is standing in court today against the victims, against international public order, to ensure that justice is rendered in this court and that it corresponds to the justice that is expected by the victims and corresponds indeed to the truth. So to convict the wrong person cannot be a form of justice expected by the victims, in particular because those truly responsible for the crimes that they suffered and endured would continue to benefit from immunity and to prosper. The sufferings of the victims need reparation, and the defence, as you know, has made a number of detailed proposals and innovative proposals for them to receive reparation immediately. And whatever the outcome of the proceedings against Mr. Ali Mohammed Ali Abd al-Rahman, these are public in nature, 02050198, and it behoves the legal representatives for victims to take them in their hands and obtain reparations for the victims. And as Ms. Clooney specifically requested, if the legal representatives takes hold of these, then the defence can assure them that they will be at the ready to support them in this approach, as long as these reparations are without prejudice as to the determination of guilt or innocence of Mr. Ali Abd al-Rahman. This being said, the defence shall now show the reasons why the Office of the Prosecutor has not met their burden of evidence, which would make it possible for Mr. Ali Abd al-Rahman, according to the standard of proof fixed by this chamber in its decision on the confirmation in charge of charges in the case of Mr. Yakutom Ngaisona. And at paragraph 17, the prosecutor has to produce concrete evidence to show that there is a clear direction in the reasoning underpinning the specific allegations, end of quote. The demonstration on the part of the defence shall be in 2 points. The first point has already been announced to you, namely that the Office of the Prosecutor has not borne the evidence according to the standard that I have just made mention of, because Mr. Ali Abd al-Rahman, whether he be implicated in any manner whatsoever in the charges, and the OTP has not brought the evidence that Mr. Ali Abd al-Rahman also bore the nickname of Ali Koshieb. That will be the first point of my presentation. And the second matter to be broached tomorrow will show that the Office of the Prosecutor has omitted to bring or even make mention of the demonstration of a constitutive element common to all the crimes charged, namely the psychological element, the knowledge, according to Article 30, paragraph 3 of the statute. And my presentation of tomorrow will be given over to this notable absence of knowledge. Now, let us start by talking about Mr. Ali Abd al-Rahman. I have heard from the Office of the Prosecutor and also from the LRVs, some of the LRVs, that Mr. Ali Abd al-Rahman was, at the time of the events, a pharmacist in Garcella, and that he sold medications, principally for livestock. And I also heard that he had a military past, that for a number of years he had been in the army. And I'm going to be a little bit more specific right from the get-go. Mr. Ali Abd al-Rahman left the army in 1990, and he left it as a warrant officer. I would suggest that we start from this basic premise. A pharmacist in Garcilla with a little bit of military experience as a point of departure with a view to ascertaining whether this individual might have become, at another moment in his life, Mr. Ali Koushib, the chief Janjaweed militiaman, commander of the Janjaweed, capable of heading up millions of Janjaweed under his orders and talking to ministers, rubbing shoulders with ministers of the Sudanese government, giving orders including to officers of the Sudanese army, receiving millions of cash in order to finance operations, to distribute weapons and uniforms, etc., etc. So this is how the prosecutor suggests that we go from pharmacist to Ali Koushib. So I will start with the pharmacist from Garcilla, with his civil status. Mr. Ali Abd al-Rahman's civil status is established. We have a number of elements to attest to the fact, and this has been given by the Office of the Prosecutor. Document DAR OTP 02160765, which is his ID card, his identity card. The identity card that has been reproduced at 0766, and it's dated the 9th of February 2010, and his civil status is, as I said.
Mr. Abdul-Rahman was born, and here I'm not going to be very precise. I'm going to give the date of the 1st of January 49. Please remember 49 and take the 1st of January as an approximation. Whatever the case, the official estimation that's made in the document DAR OTP 02160777, which is a certificate which is estimating his age from the 6th of October 1980. And that means that at the time of the events alleged by the prosecutor, 2003 to 2004, he was around 55 years old. And today, the man before you is 72 years old. He is from, please excuse my pronunciation, perhaps I'm not exact, Riyad al-Bardi, which is a locality in southern Darfur. He is from the Taisha tribe. He is the husband of 3 wives, and he had the blessing of having 18 children. Just to say a small part about how his name is made up. Ali Muhammad Ali Abdul Rahman. How is that made up? If you forget the family names and how they are composed, as we know in Europe. Here we are talking about 4 different first names, and you have to read them by generation. So I will start from the left to the right. The first, Ali, is the one which belongs to him. That would be his first name. in our uses, as my first name is Cyril. The second first name is Mohammed, the name of his father. First name of his father. The third, Ali, was the name of his grandfather. And the fourth, first name, Abdul Rahman, is the name of his great-grandfather. And that explains how his civil status name is composed. As said, he left the army on the 4th of September. And the year appears on the 4th of September. I would state again, if you take this as an element which I would like to bring to the proceedings. So in 1990, and that is important information. And when he withdrew, he had the grade of warrant officer. This is a sub-officer. And I would add, to finish, with the portrait of Mr. Abdul Rahman. You have the document DAR D31 001 005, which is a copy of his registration with the Council of Auxiliary Medical Professions, dated 1984. And that clarifies the fact that, including in the period when he was in military service, he also already exercised medical functions and he'd been trained for that. And furthermore, there's lots of evidence, which I shall come back to in my presentation, from the Office of the Prosecutor, where it says that he was part of the medical corps in the army. Now, where it concerns the document DAR 31 002 0007, now this is a document which is dated the 28th of July 2005. Now, this doesn't just concern my client, it's an order for new recruits to the group, so his number 58 to Garcilla in the Central Police Reserve. And there's a long list, and at number 189, you have the name of my client, Ali Mohammed Abdul Rahman, with the number 189 in the list. And you have the mention of debutant starter. So he is new, or blue in common language. So that's on the start of 2005. He was completely new in the Central Police Reserve. So I've finished with the presentation of the first points with regards to Mr. Al-Rahman, and I'll go on to the alias Al-Koshib. If we look at the initial hearing of Mr. Abdul Rahman, you will remember very well, Your Honour, that immediately revealed that this question was an issue, a question which would have to be dealt with. It was subject to submissions at the request of the Chamber. In the month of December, the prosecutor made submission ICC 02050120 224, in which he replied to the invitation of the Chamber to present its evidence of the alias. Now, the defence answered in its submissions ICC 02050120 235. Now, this question, which is so important because the first footnote in the prosecution brief prior to confirmation is dedicated to it, and the Office of the Prosecutor adds or selects, you can see things in different ways, it selects 6 new evidentiary items which it uses in support of the alias, and it is in this submission and this footnote number 1 that the senior trial lawyer Nichols invites the Chamber to refer to by way of introduction to this hearing. During this hearing, the different representatives of the OTP spoke one after another, presenting the facts and the evidence, referring to Mr. Ali Muhammad Ali Abdul Rahman. And in doing so, they did nothing more than implement an instruction that you had given during the initial hearing, initial appearance, and the defence has nothing to say in that regard. The only problem is that all the evidence upon which the prosecutor relies is not relating to Ali Muhammad Ali Abdul Rahman, it relates to Ali Koshieb. And of course, that means that this question of the alias is a fundamental and central question. The prosecutor is aware of this issue since the initial appearance, and we have to see together what evidence the prosecutor brings to light in this regard. Here I would like to show, if possible, I would like to show a document without it being seen by the public, so it's only seen by the people within this chamber, and this is document DAR OTP 0214 2226.
Vous me direz lorsqu'il est sur les écrans.
Please tell me when it's on the screen. DAR OTP 0200 2586 and page 2587 thereof. Now I'm going to continue speaking before it's shown. So this is from the 3rd of September 2006, and it is presented as...
Il se présente comme un procès-verbal d'interrogatoire.
It's presented as a minute or report of an interview.
Voilà.
Here it is. This was carried out by the Popular Defence Forces, and the coordinator, I don't think it's useful to say the name of that person in open session, but if we can go a bit further down the document. Thank you very much. So I explained that here, this is the interview of Mr. Ali Muhammad Ali Abdul Rahman, and then in brackets you have afterwards Ali Koshieb. Occupation, and it's written in English, warrant officer. This corresponds with adjutant in French in the Central Reserve Police, and it is described as being aged, he's described as being aged 40, and there's a telephone number. So this document dates from 2006, and that's written further up, I believe. Can we see that on the screen?
Merci, stop.
Thank you, please stop. 3rd of September 2006. And if Mr. Abdul Rahman is born when the evidence says in 49, then in 2006 he's 57. So the document, which is an official document from the police, a document which should have probative value in judicial proceedings. This must be a serious document. It's not just a document quickly made up. And after verification, it would appear that the person who was interviewed is aged 40 years old. So you've got 40 years and you've got 57 years. Now, error is, of course, possible. Now, if we go a bit further down in the page, if you would be so kind, a bit further. If you could go up a bit.
Stop.
you could stop there. I'm looking for the passage, excuse me, where he is described as the Emir of Mujahid Vigilantes in Gazilla. Oh, it's at the top. Emir of Mujahid Vigilantes in Gazilla. That's it, just below telephone on the screen.
Of Garcilla, I was settled in that area. I was Emir of Mujahid Vigilance in Garcilla, West Darfur, etc.
Etc.
Plusieurs informations intéressantes.
There's a lot of interesting information here. Firstly, the mention of the occupation of the person who is interviewed, a warrant officer. If you could go back up a bit, please. I'm sorry. A warrant officer with the Central Reserve Police. This is in 2006, and I'll remind you that in 2005, in July 2005, Mr. Abdul Rahman joined the police as a new recruit without a grade, and he very quickly in 2006 has the grade of warrant officer. Now we are told that he had the title of Emir of Mujahideen Vigilantes in Gazilla at the time of the events, and I compare that with the document DAR-OTP 0037-0016, which is an information report from the High Commissioner for Human Rights, in which the person who is interviewed explains that Ali Koushib received his instructions from the Emir, Mahmoud Salah Issa, and from the Amid. So we have an Emir from Mujahideen Vigilance who is at the time receiving instructions and orders from two other Emirs. I don't claim to be an expert in the Sudanese hierarchy, I just observe that. And furthermore, what is interesting is the reference that's made to the PDF, the Popular Defence Forces. So at the time of the events, Mr. Koushib was said to have been a member of the Popular Defence Forces. Now, we've never heard this in the prosecutor's case file. This has never been pleaded. He's described as a Janjaweed chief, yes, but his affiliation with Popular Defence Forces is not part of the case file. And furthermore, if we look at paragraph 29 of the pretrial brief, and here I will read there from.
The NSC, National Security Council, issued an emergency plan that formed the basis for the government of Sudan to launch its counterinsurgency campaign. The emergency plan stated that members of the SAF, Sudan Armed Forces, and PDF, Popular Defense Forces, could not be trusted to participate in the counterinsurgency campaign because the majority were from Darfur, and police and reservist forces, such as the CRF, did not have sufficient members to combat the rebels. Ce sont les considérants.
So these are the considering parts which are before the substantive parts of the brief about the mobilization of the militia with regards to the counter-insurrection. So what we are told here by the Office of the Prosecutor, and what we are also told on the basis of this statement, that you have the witness in DAR-OTP 0214-0534R01, and the page is 0550-0551, and paragraph 64 thereof, you have the PDF who were excluded from the counter-insurrection because the government of Sudan did not trust them. So the person who is interviewed in the document on your screen was a member of that body, and he didn't didn't have the trust of the government of Sudan to participate in the counter-insurrection, and he would have participated as an emir, not the grade, but the title of emir, receiving instructions, allegedly. I can see that perhaps I'm speaking a bit too fast, and I'd like to apologize to the interpreters. So I've finished with this document, which is on the screen. The second reference in footnote 1 of the brief is a reference to witness P818. I'm not going to give you the precise page, but the passage mentions the fact that Ali Koshaib was the leader of the Janjaweed, a soldier, that he withdrew from the army. He left the army with the grade of adjutant, and that he started a pharmacy in Garcilla to sell medicine for animals. He established a veterinary pharmacy for medicine for animals. So, leader of the Janjaweed. That doesn't make it possible to make the link. So he's retired from the army. He started a pharmacy. He sells products for animals. That could correspond. If we look at, there's another reference at the bottom of page 1, which takes to another page which has nothing to do with it. It was inserted by error, so I won't spend any time on that. But the fourth reference is P905 DAROTP 1321, where it is indicated that in page 1343 that Ali Koshaib, this witness is perhaps not totally informed when he states that, because when he speaks about Mr. Abdul Rahman, this witness says that he had 2 girls, but this is something we contest. Now, when it comes to the other witness, he says that Ali Koshaib was the commander of the Janjaweed. Very well, but that doesn't make the link with Abdul Rahman. Now, the witness 912, and this is the last reference, talks about a shepherd belonging to one of the tribes in Darfur with light skin, but not as light skinned as some of the people of the north. I'm not going to spend any time on that, but those are the 6 elements of evidence presented by the Office of the Prosecutor in its brief on the confirmation hearing to establish the link between Mr. Abdul Rahman and the alias Ali Koshaib. So, it would be an injustice to the Office of the Prosecutor to, if we just limit ourselves to footnote 1, in order to have a complete overview, you also have to look at its December submission and the numerous annexes, December 2020, and these, as I said, in the document ICC 020501202224. So a certain number of witnesses talk about the pharmacy in Garcilla, and that is something I mentioned, but I'm not going to spend much more time on that. So if we go to witness P11, we are told in the document DAR 00880219, pages 0234, 0235, paragraphs 91 to 92, that Ali Koshaib had a pharmacy, that he had several houses, and that he was a commander of the Fursan. Very well. Witness P12 DAR OTP 01190503, in page 0510 to 0512, tells us that he was appointed as Tأكيد in March 2003 because of his military experience and education. Very well. I don't have any evidence to show you, but I would indicate by way of information that Mr. Abdul Al-Haman, he left finished his education at the beginning of the middle of secondary school, that he left the army services as a warrant officer, and that he was attached to the medical corps within the army. And furthermore, the registration with the Auxiliary Medical Council, which has already been mentioned, and attests thereto. So we're talking about military experience and education. Let's be reasonable. Here we're speaking about the education of somebody who finished his studies at the middle of secondary school, and he got to the rank of warrant officer within the army. So this same witness, P12, also tells us that Ali Koushib was
esclave de la tribu Rizeigat.
Slave of the Rizegot tribe. And he states he's partly Rizegot. Now, this is information that's interesting. I'd ask the chamber to focus on this. I already mentioned that Mr. Abdul Rahman was Taisha. He's not a Rizegat, but remember the name Rizegat because you're going to hear about that tribe a bit later in my presentation, when I will speak about the other Janjaweed chiefs who are known, and in particular one with Emidi, with the name of Emidi. Witness P12 states that Mr. Abdul Rahman is from Eastern Darfur, and no, he doesn't speak about him. Otherwise, by way of error, he speaks about Ali Koushib. He says Ali Koushib is from Eastern Darfur and from the locality of Al Diain. Mr. Abdul Rahman, and this is why this error is important, is from Southern Darfur, from Rihad El Berdi, from that locality. Now I'll go on to witness P44. No, that's not very interesting. He talks about the pharmacy. Let's go on to P60. That's what I want to talk about. P60, DAR OTP 0097 0328. On page 0334 thereof, paragraph 22, he describes a tall man with a dark complexion who used to sell medication for animals in the market. And he has a very precise memory in this regard. He remembers that Ali Koushib in 1993
Sell the medication.
So according to this witness, Ali Koushib in 93 was delivering products via his bicycle, delivering medical products. Now, in 2003, the Janjaweed commander, and he commands thousands of people, orders the army, is deciding over life and death of all people, who the officer, the prosecutor, and the legal representatives of victims speak about. Now, this describes the Sudan as a country in which the social ladder, or the social lift, is broken, and it hardly functions there. And in 10 years, you can go from being a bicycle delivery person to an omnipotent commander. So, Slumdog Millionaire. This is a very nice film, but it is fiction. And I think that it's difficult to believe that in 10 years, the same person could have gone from being a bicycle delivery boy to an omnipotent commander. I will stop at P92 DAR OTP 01120175 and page 183 thereof, and he describes Mr. Ali Koushib, and he speaks about him as a Nuba. Very well. He's Daisha, Mr. Alderman, and he states that he allegedly became the Agid, the term Agid al-Qaid of the Forsan, Agid al-Qaid of the Forsan, that he was promoted before the presidency of Mr. al-Bashir. The presidency of Mr. al-Bashir started in 1995. The Office of the Prosecutor explained to us yesterday that Mr. Abdul Rahman became Abdul Rahman in 1990. The Office of the Prosecutor tells us that he would have been so before 1989. With regard to P117, he states that Ali Koushib was recruited at the time when the conflict started into the popular police forces. And this is DAR OTP 01280042 and page 071 thereof. We've never heard anyone speak about the recruitment of Mr. Abdul Rahman in the popular police forces in the prosecutor's presentation or in their brief. So I will continue just until you stop me, Your Honour. Any time is good.
A specific point, please stop here.
J'ai encore une page.
I've got one more page of references from the submissions of the Office of the Prosecutor. It's perhaps a bit long. I could take it up after the break.
And the hearing is adjourned at 2:30. Thank you very much.
All rise. Veuillez vous lever.
Pas grave.